some really, wow, I'm still trying to digest those last few moments, but all of our discussions, I think, are provocative when we think about the changing ideas of Remembrance Day over the decades. We have to think briefly about the 30s to the 60s with Dave, the ideas of competing narratives that Nathan and Kirk have brought up are really well worth thinking about. And then when we think of also what Skid's saying, the ultimate irony is that Canada is supposed to be a peaceable kingdom, and yet the narratives that we somehow use, as some people argue, make us out to be a warrior nation, which doesn't seem to be the case in the narratives that are created in a modern united Germany. So we do have some time for questions. I don't care what you guys say. The kinds of presentations that we've got provoke them. So please, Dan, you want to jump in?
I'd love to, yeah. Thanks everyone for coming, and fascinating stuff I have to say. But I wanted to explore a little bit more the, national narratives, constructed national narratives in the post-war, and its influence on commemoration. It seems to me, from what you were saying, Dave, that there's, thank you. Do you think I need it?
I don't think you need it.
You need it for the cameras.
Oh, do I?
Yeah, I'm sorry. There.
It seems to me that there's an awful lot of parallels, of course, between British commemoration on November 11th and Canadian commemoration. And it seems to me almost, and I know very little, unfortunately, about Canada's evolution of commemoration and national narrative, but it seems to me that it's almost identical. It's almost mirrored, with the one exception, of course, of this commemoration of Remembrance being this one positive moment in what otherwise was, futile and wasteful and things like that. Very similar to, of course, British commemoration of the Somme. But is that the case with Canada's Second World War narrative? And I'm thinking specifically of the fact that, the Brits have a wonderful way of taking, disasters and turning them into victories. Things like the Blitz and things like Dunkirk specifically. But how has Canada dealt with things like Dieppe, for example? I haven't seen, I've been in this country quite a while now, I haven't seen an awful lot surrounding Dieppe, with the exception of perhaps a history television special or something along those lines. I mean, does Canada tend to, does Canada's narrative constructed in that heroic way that the United Kingdom does, of Spitfires and Vera Lynn songs and things like that, or is it much more sort of trending towards First World War sort of imagery, that particular aspect?
Well, I guess I can answer that. Maybe. Dieppe is our Dunkirk. So there's any number of different narratives there that simply say we sacrifice so that we could win elsewhere. Right. So the book I'm thinking of is Denny Whitaker's book, who was at Dieppe, called Tragedy to Triumph. Right. And it speaks directly to that whole narrative, that somehow we managed to learn all the bad lessons that we'll need to succeed later on. So, that narrative fits in pretty well with the kind of idea of the Somme, or the idea of the British disaster, which will eventually reflect on the heroism of individuals, which is a pretty common narrative, and that will eventually lead to victory. So it's Whig history of the worst kind.
Yeah, it seems to me Kirk was saying, there's certain elements of whitewashing when it comes to Second World War narratives, and I know that certainly, that victorious narrative certainly tends to overpower an awful lot of the very negative aspects in British memorialization. So it seems like it's very similar.
Yeah. Sorry, do you want to just comment, or?
No, I was going to say that there's also the added complexity of the French-Canadian and English-Canadian perspective on Dieppe. And so if you look at French-Canadian textbooks, for instance, Dieppe is just another example in which, Canada sends their French-Canadians to get killed. Right. So, there is that whole other realm of complexity as well.
Right.
Yeah. Anyone else? We'll come back to you for a second, but let me just ask Skid, because the comparison you made between the German and the Canadian, or indeed any of you, do you just think that we've created such an overly militaristic form of remembrance that there's a real, the CBC, I don't want to sound like Noah Richler here for a second, but I watched the coverage today of Ottawa, and we've become a warrior nation. I mean, it's extraordinary, and that transformation over the last 10 or 15 years, perhaps reinforced by the whole idea of Afghanistan. We see it in sporting events. The sort of, it's hard to go to the ACC now without seeing some reference to the military when the hockey games are on. It's a really dramatic change, it seems, over the course of years, and it lacks any irony. It lacks any sense of accommodating alternative narratives. So, have we gotten it right, or have we gotten it wrong?
Well, let me attempt an answer at that. I'm not, let me put it this way. It was interesting how Kirk pointed out that there's, so in Canadian history, we don't know about the bombing of this island in Holland and the destruction we caused to the people of Holland in liberating them. We know a great deal about the atrocities committed by the German army in the Second World War, for example. And I'm not talking about the SS, I'm talking about the German army, the regular army, which on the Eastern Front at least, it can be argued, was systematically and from the top down through the ranks involved in the destruction of peoples in Eastern Europe. And when you have that kind of history, it's very difficult then, I think, as a nation to turn around and commemorate war dead. I just think it would be difficult. And I think in Canada, we've been blessed, maybe naively so, by thinking that, well, our soldiers fought the good war, fought the good fight, fought on the right side, and were, more or less decent chaps. Sure, there were a few problems there a few years ago with some of the prisoner of war things and stuff like that was going on in Somalia, for example. But on the whole, Canada's military record is unblemished in comparison with the absolutely horrific record of German military. Now, I think you could say the same for some other militaries, and in those countries, though, they might be able to commemorate something like Remembrance Day, and I would think it's because those countries have not undergone the process of the process of, let's call it, true remembrance, a process where we really come to terms with what went on in the past and we examine it in minute detail. And if you're at all familiar with German culture today, or German culture or public intellectual life of the past 20, 30 years, especially in West Germany, every aspect of Germany's military or imperialistic endeavors has been examined. I mean, there's still more to discover, I'm sure, but historians will have lots to do still. I don't want to make people think they won't have jobs in German history, but there's so much has been uncovered and has been laid out in public, in full public view. And I'm not sure that's happening in Canada, so I'll just be a little controversial there. So.
Good. Gary, do you want to jump in?
Wonder if the elephant in the room a little bit is what the government of the day is, and whether it is a right-wing or left-wing government, and how we remember the past. So I know a little bit about what Skid's talking about, and I would, I would suggest that post-war German commemoration of the war has been a complete and utter disaster. In the 1980s, as late as the 1980s, the Chancellor of Germany is laying wreaths at a cemetery that has SS soldiers in it. And that's obviously a right-wing government. Here, don't know if we want to go down this path, but when you talk about the militarization or the warrior nation, well, we have a conservative government in power. I mean, I think, and going back to Dave's presentation too, this might cut across all your presentations, how much does it matter whether it is a left liberal government, a right-wing government, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Germany? I mean, isn't that really the determining factor about how we remember on this day?
Had you thought about that, David?
Sorry.
No. I mean, just because most of the period of the 50s and 60s is governed through the liberal peace, well, the beginning of the peacekeeping period, I suppose, maybe starts to challenge.
Yeah, that doesn't really. I mean, the peacekeepers aren't actually really officially included in Remembrance Day ceremonies until the 80s.
Right. Right.
And when you look at some of the speeches and some of the even the educational material throughout that period, there's mention of the Korean War. There's mention of the First and Second World War. They even mentioned, pray for our troops who are on NATO missions, but nothing related to the peacekeepers. So that sort of service and memory doesn't really fit into the way that Remembrance Day was viewed. At the same time, you can see the sort of strands of things that the government at the time was pushing, whether it be in the 50s, the late 50s with the conservative governments, and you end up, as I mentioned, getting sort of themes of British heritage, and we remember those who laid the foundations for our country, kind of thing. And then into the 60s and 70s as multiculturalism, it's interesting the activities that they suggest for teachers. They want the students in the 70s to think more about do we have a Canadian society? Are some Canadian citizens second class? So it's more thinking about the world that they live in now rather than, the sort of remembrance as we understand it.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I think Gary has a good point there, but there are surprising counter examples. So for as one example, when the far right, there's a far right party in the Saxon Landtag, in the state parliament of Saxon, attempted to push through a measure whereby the bombing of Dresden would be equally recognized as the liberation of Auschwitz. It was the conservative parties, the CDU, that really slammed them down and said, no, we will not do that. Well, but they also made the right decision. You didn't, sure, political expediency can be part of it, but it doesn't mean that if they could have voted with the far right, they would have. I don't believe that at all. I believe they felt that they understood that to attempt to raise Dresden up to as equally important as Auschwitz was to relativize history, and would be to try to destroy the goodwill that Germany had accumulated over the past decades by trying to acknowledge and to put forward first its responsibility for the Holocaust before claiming its own victimhood. So I think the conservative politicians in Germany, by and large, are completely in step with that approach.
Thank you, Aaron. Sorry. Josh.
Thank you. Sorry. I have a question for Mr. Goodlet, and I'm going to try and make it sound intelligent. Hopefully it is. Mr. Goodlet, and maybe some other people can throw some stuff in as well. Should we as academics, and budding academics, be pushing for a more realistic narrative through our museums, through our memorials and memorial days, even if it may upset veterans' families and etc., our attachment to Canada's democratic allied, good guy kind of myth. What good would come out of that apart from giving Canadians the full account of our actions during the Second World War?
That's a very good question, Josh.
Yes.
It wasn't planned. One of the
Feel
issues.
there's collusion there somehow.
One of the issues with museums in general is the idea of a commercialization. Ultimately, I mean, museums do exist to hold history and to tell a certain narrative, but at a certain point, they also try to get visitors, and they need to survive and get money. And we've talked about this in the context of my dissertation. When do museums open, and what is the message they decide to tell? And this particular museum that I'm talking about in Vescapella opens up in the late 80s, early 90s, around what Jay Winter would call a memory boom, periods during which key anniversaries take place, and there's a buzz around 95th anniversary, centenaries, or whatever. So I think that's a big issue involved in setting up a museum, or at least opening a museum. And the other thing is, if you're in the Netherlands, if you're in some obscure area like Zeeland, what's the demographic like? And anyone who's been to Vescapella knows it's a German place for vacationing. And one Dutch person, an archivist, actually said to me, they're back, they're occupying again, but this time they're paying for their stay. But anyway, so to what degree do museums try to satisfy the demographic that actually visits them? And so I'm kind of toying with this idea now. Are they not talking about German occupation because they really like their business? What else is bringing business to that area? And I think the same could be said, and the same idea could be applied to other museums as well. I don't know if that answers your question, Dory.
That happiness and satisfaction sells in Canada?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Nathan, what does your other button say?
To remember is to work for peace.
Is to work for peace. Can you, okay, you guys, jump in, sorry.
I was just going to ask Dave and Kirk what you thought of the White Poppy movement this year. Dave, kind of like how it fits in with your narrative of the changing of the way that we remember stuff, and Kirk, like how you saw like remembrance in Canada.
Can I just suggest that somebody explain what the White Poppy movement is? Because I think some people here don't know what it is.
Sure. Who wants to explain what the White Poppy is?
Basically, the White Poppy movement that has erupted in the news was so apparently begun by a girl, Céline Dufay, at the University of Ottawa, and it's a movement involving wearing white poppies as opposed to the Legion-sanctioned red one, which represents peace. And they claim, this small group claims that that the red poppy glorifies war as opposed to peace. So that's the White Poppy.
And the origins of the White Poppy actually go back into the 1920s as certain post-war disillusionment sets in. So there, and Dave, I'm sure would have touched on this. I mean, well, you touch on it in the context of the 30s, but that competing vision, I suppose, at Remembrance Day, which certainly becomes prevalent, is reflected in the White Poppy. Yeah.
I think that for me anyway, I'm not particularly against the White Poppy, simply because, as Dave has shown, the history of Armistice Day or Remembrance Day has evolved almost continuously for 80 years, and so does a change in that direction really constitute some kind of break in the past? And I don't necessarily agree with that. For me personally, I really try to think about the human element, the sort of the anthropological element in conflict. So thinking about these victims as people, not just numbers, and simply treating them as such.
Good. Did you, a question up here? Yeah. Can you just pass the mic back, please?
First off, thank you to the panel for forward-rate thoughts. Very much appreciated. My question relates to, and I think they're quite right, remembrance needs to be inclusive, rather than just the First World War, Second World War, Korean War, so on and so forth. Involvements that Canadians are involved in these conflicts should be recognized. My question relates to peace. Canada's peacekeeping missions in particular. How should that be remembered? As we all know, the history of peacekeeping is very convoluted. It's a very complex issue. How do Canadians keep the peace? Well, they keep the peace in a not very peaceful manner. By conflict. Not all examples, but the majority. So my question is, to any of you, how do you think peacekeeping and should be remembered in particular?
Yeah.
Just gonna go.
You're going for it tonight.
I need a beer. If you look at the sort of the tail end of peacekeeping, I would identify it in the Balkans, actually, in the 1990s with UNPROFOR failing miserably, and sort of the culminating in the massacre at Srebrenica in Bosnia. But I think that, again, peacekeeping is an issue that I think should be involved in Remembrance Day ceremonies. Obviously, there are people who wear a uniform and they stand in the way of some pretty terrible things. And just look at Romeo Dallaire, for example. I mean, in terms of PTSD, what we would call PTSD now, I mean, he's obviously affected by what he has seen and done. So I would say that I would have no problem with including peacekeeping in terms of in Remembrance Day ceremonies at all.
Can I just
Do you wanna-
jump in with a tiny little follow-up question?
Sure.
to that? There's a movement, of course, going on right now in the UK that's being run by the Quakers, and that is to memorialise individuals who were shot as conscientious objectors. Do you think that Remembrance Day commemoration should include individuals who decided not necessarily not to die for their country, but not to kill for their country?
You better take that one, Nathan.
Yeah, Nathan.
I think certainly being willing to go there and to acknowledge that happened would enrich the conversation. Part of the value of having plural stories, narratives, and experiences to look in the face what wars have involved, the full scope of it.
Okay, you get the last question. Can you hand that? You grab the microphone right behind you. Thank you.
Do you think Canada should try and remember the wars that have been forgotten, like the Boer War and the Spanish War? Because those aren't really included, that Canada did serve. Canada did serve heavily in the Boer War with the victory at the Battle of Passchendaele, even though it was like a fluke, but also with the volunteering of Canadians going over to Spain to help keep the peace there in the 1930s.
Wow. Good question. I'll just say that one of the points that Kirk made at the very end, memory is about forgetting as much as it is about remembering. So when you deal with the Boer War, you've got to deal with some bizarre ideas of imperialism that Canadians felt very strongly about, which maybe is not all that much different than what we feel today, but I won't go that far either. And the Spanish Civil War is a really curious one. And indeed, there has been debates about whether or not those veterans should be recognized. They're all gone now, too, almost. And of course, the inconvenient truth about that is that most of the Canadians who left and went to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side were communists. So it's tricky to try to create narratives that don't fit. Once you've created the narrative about Canada sending troops off to fight, it's hard to deal with those ones. And as a result, we create, and this is why historians have such a hard time on Remembrance Day, is that we tend to create a selective history that seems to satisfy a certain emotional feeling or a certain national feeling that neglects an enormous number of stories. I can assure you that in French Canada right now, the sense of remembrance that's so evoked in communities like our own or in Ottawa are very slight, very slight. The narrative that they choose is a very different one. And so, and as we say, one of the things that Dave's made the point about is that narratives are really hard to change. People are, what would you say, invested in a narrative. And to try to challenge it, well, and we can see that, to try to challenge it in the context of the discussions that Dave's traced over the 60s is really hard to do. Because what it does is to sort of, everyone's heels get dug in, and you begin to repeat the rhetoric and repeat so much to the point that you're in my first year class, and when I asked them about the significance of Vimy Ridge, and I told them repeatedly that it's not the nation-building exercise that everybody says it is, they ignored me and insisted that Vimy Ridge is a great point in which Canada becomes a nation, at which point I almost have to give up. But it does show the strength of that narrative, you know, against all logic, against all context, against all the ways in which we might try to convince people, against the casualties, which are horrific. People really do embrace, in much the way that we're talking about, these national stories, which are very selectively chosen. And in many ways, driven by particular agendas of the present as well as the past. So, you know, great question. I can tell you, Stephen Harper ain't talking about the Spanish Civil War anytime soon. You know? So, on that note, yeah, I hope this is really, we might well all go off to another place to celebrate this stuff, but we'll do that off camera. I do want to thank Dave and Nathan and Skid and that guy at the end, Kirk, for what were really thoughtful and provocative questions that I hope will, at the end of any Remembrance Day, my mentor Terry keeps saying what we need is informed remembrance, and that I think is something very different than what we often come to feel about Remembrance Day. So I'm very pleased that I think what we did tonight was a great exercise in informed memory, in challenging and questioning and talking about alternative narratives, which to me, and the evolving nature of this whole exercise, which to me is really important. So please allow me or help me join in thanking these people and Aaron Campbell, who organized the night.